Hey guys, so this is going to be a review for The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This is the first book in the King Killer Chronicles. And yeah, let's just jump right into it. This is the story of Quoth. Literally, that is what it is about in its entirety. It reads as a sort of autobiography of Quoth's life, built within a sort of framing device of Quoth telling the story to us. The book begins with Quoth at this point going as Coat to avoid suspicions that he is who he actually is as an innkeeper. He's like in his late 20s or early 30s, somewhere around there, quite young for an innkeeper, in a town called Nuar that's starting to somehow become infested with these spider-like demon creatures called Scrael. Quoth runs the inn with his student and assistant Bast when one of the inn's regulars comes in one night with the corpse of a Scrael that he killed. This kind of prompts Quoth to go out one night to investigate and hopefully find and kill some of the Scrael in order to help out the town. Now, everyone knows something about Quoth. Everyone has heard stories about him in some form or another. He's at the same time seen as a hero and a villain, this real savior and a legend, and many mix up the various stories surrounding him, as they've only heard of his accomplishments through word of mouth, which of course distorts the stories quite a bit. Above everything else, despite just being a guy, really, he's seen as being very, very powerful and has done things that generally blow people's minds. But of course his stories have been distorted over the years. They've blown up quite a bit. While the things he's done are obviously awesome, people can be a bit crazy sometimes about how they see him. So basically when Quoth goes out, kind of putting behind him the persona of Coat for the night to hopefully destroy some of the Scrael, he ends up saving a man called Chronicler, who is still badly injured enough for Quoth to take him back to the inn. Chronicler recognizes Quoth sort of immediately. Quoth has some very distinct features, like his blazing fire red hair and these mood changing green eyes. And Quoth has also heard of Chronicler. Chronicler is someone who kind of goes around and tries to find the real stories behind things and writes about them. He goes out trying to find real stories and figure out how they happened, exactly how they happened, instead of just letting them be these distorted word-of-mouth things. He's actually been looking around for Quoth because he wants to know what Quoth has really been through, to find the real story exactly as it happened, as opposed to the way people always describe how things have happened in the legends, but only Quoth knows the full story. He tells Chronicler that it'll take 3 days to tell the full story of his life, up until the point where he has come to own his own inn, starting with his childhood. That then is how the book is sort of structured, him telling Chronicler and his assistant Bast all about his story, with a few brief interludes back to present time in the inn whenever Quoth feels like he has to stop for whatever reason. And this book, Name of the Wind, is day 1 of Quoth's storytelling. Quoth's story then begins with his childhood. He grew up traveling the continent with his parents and their troupe of traveling performers, the Edema Ra. Quoth's parents are amazing musicians, actors, and performers. The Edema Ra are famous and are known just all over for their amazing showmanship and the integrity in their performances. During his time with the Edema Ra, Quoth learns how to play the lute, how to be an actor, and generally he is just really, really smart. He is really intelligent and just learns things really, really fast. The troupe eventually picks up like a sort of magical scholar named Abinthy, who eventually teaches Quoth some beginning lessons on this very complicated and difficult to understand magic system. It's confusing when explained, but as you kind of see it in action throughout the rest of the book, you kind of realize more and more what's happening and how it works. One part of it is called sympathy, basically done by taking energy either from your own body or from another outside force like fire, creating a bond between objects, and using this kind of thermodynamic psychokinesis to affect the bonded object. And then there's also naming, finding the true name of something like an object or a force, as opposed to just the given name that we have given it, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. And anyway, basically Abinthy just teaches him a bit about sympathy, teaches him for a while, and then eventually leaves the troupe. And then one day while Quoth is off doing something, some things happen that kind of force him to go off and be on his own. And then we kind of follow him as he becomes a street urchin in the city called Trabian. He lives on the streets, he barely scrapes by, He barely survives most of the time, and he kind of learns how to survive. He teaches himself how to survive by living in Trabian on the streets for several years. He then goes off to this place that Abinthy always talked about called the University, where they teach more about the magical system, about sympathy, and about naming, and about a bunch of other stuff related to how they do magic in this world. He meets a lot of people and learns a lot of things really fast, and he kind of ranks up a lot faster than most people do. He kind of becomes an accomplished musician, and we basically just follow the happenings of his life, see the grand events of his life that have led to some of the legends surrounding him, and how they actually happened from Quoth's perspective. This was a really, really great story. I really liked it a lot. I really enjoyed reading it, and I really enjoyed Patrick Rothfuss's writing style. It's very poetic at times, and you can kind of tell that he really chose how he went about describing things very meticulously. He chose his words very carefully because the words are obviously very important to him, which I can both appreciate and connect with a lot. This story is not much like other fantasy that I've read. It isn't like a journey, it isn't an adventure, it isn't like a vast epic with a ton of different viewpoints that bring together the story as a whole. There really honestly isn't even like a driving force, like a grand villain or a big evil or something, like nothing to like chase after and defeat necessarily. I mean, yes, there is evil there, and it is pretty important, and in Quoth does come across quite a bit of like few of minor like enemies in the streets of Trabian and at the university, but he isn't like going out and actively pursuing this big evil in the world and doing something about it. He's trying to learn about it. He takes quite a bit of time and puts in the effort to try and study it and figure it out for a reason from his past and all that I don't want to talk about to spoil anything. But there is no like immediate danger to him at that moment that is out of his control. A lot of the threats to him he kind of creates himself. I mean, this is really completely the story of Quoth. If you don't like Quoth, then you most likely will not like the book or the story, because it's him in its entirety. This book is Quoth. He is the driving force, which is fairly unique for a story like this, but is also probably a reason that some people wouldn't like it. But I really like Quoth a lot. I enjoyed what he had to say, learning about his life, seeing what he's done and why. He has a really great voice. He's, in my opinion, just a really great character and definitely worth reading about, and all the other characters are really great too. And also really fun to read about, like the Enamora, the people he meets in Trabian, the people he meets at the university, the teachers and the students, his friends, the main love interest, Denna. They're all pretty interesting, and I really enjoyed hearing about them through Quoth's perspective. He does come across sometimes as very out there, but it's in a fairly human way. Like, we learn a lot about what he's done and what he's accomplished, and it isn't necessarily like the impossible, legend-like, heroic, inhuman way that most people in this book would describe him as being, that later on, like at the time that he owns an inn, that people would look back and describe his stories as being. He is just really a gifted person that kind of knows how to make himself look really good in every situation that he puts himself in. Something that bugs me quite a bit about a lot of fantasy books I read, this one in particular seemed to do it a lot, is the excessive use of like weird language and naming things, like especially in this story, because naming is really important, and apparently naming is such a really big part of the world. And in the story, like, things are just given these crazy, seemingly arbitrary fantasy-esque names that are just laughable sometimes, and at other times like cringeworthy, if that makes sense. Like, Patrick Rothfuss wrote down as many names of things that could sound like they were in a fantasy book, puts them in a jar, and then drew from the jar every time needed to name something in the book. Like, he'll just go on and on about these things we know nothing about and that we aren't necessarily supposed to know anything about, with these crazy arbitrary fantasy names, and it just seems like it just doesn't work. Like the language some people speak in this, the things they sometimes have to say in order to do magic, the names of some of the inns and the bars, and the names of some of the characters and the cities, names of random gods, or just whatever. I don't want to compare things necessarily. Like, Brandon Sanderson, for example, does a really great job of introducing concepts with real explanation. Like, there's a reason based on some sort of logic that he'll explain to us, or naming certain things the way they're named, or at the very least things will seem consistent. The names of people and places will seem consistent with the world and the atmosphere that's been built. But in this, a lot of that just seems really overdone. Everything seems to be randomly chosen and inconsistent and weird. I don't know, I hope all of that makes sense. I'm not sure if it does make sense. It was really hard to figure out how to say all of that. Basically, I find a lot of fantasy stories use a lot of really weird namings of things, and it just doesn't seem like any of it fits. Anyway, overall I really enjoyed reading this. I gave it a 4.5, and I'm definitely interested in reading the next one very soon. Great story with great characters and generally really great writing style. You'll either love or hate Quoth most likely, which will probably determine whether or not you like the book as a whole, but I really enjoyed it, and you should definitely check it out if any of that sounds interesting to you. But anyway, that's everything I have to say. Let me know if you read this, what you thought of it, if you agree or disagree, whatever, and I'll see you guys very soon with more. Thank you so much for watching. That's starting to be